Hello, guys. Welcome to Psych Minds. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share. We are reading We the Living by Anne Rand, chapter 13 of part 2. Leo had been locked in a cell at the GPU. Andre had come home. At the gate of the palace garden, a party comrade hurrying into the club had stopped him. You're giving us a report on the agrarian situation tonight, Comrade Taganov, aren't you? He had asked. Yes, Andre had answered. He had walked slowly through the deep snow of the garden up the long stairs to his dark room. A club window was lighted in the palace and a yellow square fell across the floor. Andre took off his cap, his leather jacket, his gun. He stood by the fireplace, kicking grey coals with his toe. He threw a log on the coals and struck a match. He sat on a box by the fire, his hands hanging limply between his knees, his hands and his forehead pink in the darkness. He heard steps on the landing outside, then a hand knocking sharply. He had not locked the door. He said, "Come in." Kira came in. She slammed the door behind her and stood in the archway of his room. He could not see her eyes in the darkness. Black shadows swallowed her eyes and forehead, but the red glow fell on her mouth, and her mouth was wide, loose, brutal. He rose and stood silently, looking at her. "Well?" She threw at him savagely. "What are you going to do about it?" He said slowly. "If I were you, I would get out of here." She leaned against the archway, asking, "And if I don't?" "Go get out of here," he repeated. She tore her hat off and flung it aside. She threw her coat off and dropped it to the floor. "Get out, you whore," she finished for him. "Certainly. I just want to be sure you know that that's what I am." He asked, "What do you want? I have nothing to say to you." "But I have, and you will listen. So you have got me, haven't you, Comrade Taganov? And you're going to have your revenge. You came with your soldiers with a gun on your hip, Comrade Taganov of the GPU, and you arrested him. And now you're going to use all your influence, all your great party influence, to see that he's put before the firing squad, aren't you? Perhaps you will even ask for the privilege of giving the order to fire. Go ahead, have your revenge, and this is mine. I'm not pleading for him, I have nothing to fear anymore. But at least I can speak, and I will speak. I have so much to say to you, to all of you, and I have kept silent for so long that it's going to tear me to pieces. I have nothing to lose, but you have." He said, "Don't you think it is useless? Why say anything? If you have any excuses to offer." She laughed, a human laughter that did not sound human, that did not sound like laughter. "You fool! I'm proud of what I have done. Hear me, I don't regret it. I'm proud of it. So you think I loved you, don't you? I loved you, but I was unfaithful to you on the side, as most women are. Well, then listen. All you were to me, you and your great love and your kisses and your body, all they were meant was only a pack of crisp, white, square 10 ruble bills with a sickle and hammer printed in the corner. Do you know where those bills went? To a tubercular sanatorium in the Crimea. Do you know what they paid for? For the life of a man I loved long before I ever saw you. For the life of a body that had possessed mine before you ever touched it. And now you're holding him in one of your cells and you're going to shoot him. Why not? It's fair enough. Shoot him. Take his life. You have paid for it." She saw his eyes and they were not hurt. They were not angry. They were frightened. He said, "Kira, I, I didn't know." She leaned back and crossed her arms and rocked softly, laughing. "So you loved me. So I was the highest of women, a woman like a temple, like a military march, like a god statue. Remember who told me that? Well, look at me. I'm only a whore, and you are the one who made the first payment. I sold myself for money, and you paid it. Down in the gutter, that's where I belong, and your great love put me there. I thought you would be glad to know that, aren't you? So you think I loved you? I thought of Leo when you held me in your arms. When I spoke of love, I was speaking to him. I've never loved him as I loved him in your bed. No, I won't leave you or your memories. They are his. I love him. Do you hear me? I love him. Go ahead, kill him. Nothing you can do to him will compare with what I have done to you. You know that, don't you? She stood swaying, and her shadow rose to the ceiling, and the shadow rocked as if it were going to crash down. He repeated helplessly, as if she were not present, as if he were hanging on to the syllables for support. I didn't know. No, you didn't know, but it was very simple and not very unusual. Go through the garrets and basements where men live in your great cities and see how many cases like this you can find. He wanted to live. You think everything that breathes can live? You have learned differently, I know. But he was the one who could have lived. There aren't many of them, so they don't count with you. The doctor said he was going to die and I loved him. You have learned what that means too, haven't you? He didn't need much, only rest and fresh air and food. He had no right to that, had he? Your state said so. We tried to beg, we begged humbly. Do you know what they said? There was a doctor in a hospital and he said he had hundreds on his waiting list. She leaned forward, her voice soft, confidential. She spread her hands out, trying to explain, suddenly gentle and businesslike and childishly insistent. Her lips soft and a little bewildered, and only her eyes fixed in her eyes. Alone, a horror that did not belong in a room where human beings lived out only in a morgue. Lived, but only in a morgue. You see, you must understand this thoroughly. No one does. No one sees it, but I do. I can't help it. I see it. You must see it too. You understand. Hundreds, thousands, millions. Millions of what? Stomachs and heads and legs and tongues and souls. And it doesn't even matter whether they fit together. Just millions. Just flesh, human flesh, and it had been registered and numbered, like tin cans on a store shelf. I wondered if they are registered by the person or by the pound, and they had a chance to go on living, but not Leo. He was only a man. All stones are cobblestones to you, and diamond, they are useless because they sparkle too brightly in the sun. And it's too hard on the eyes, and it's too hard under the hoofs marching into the proletarian future. You don't pave roads with diamonds. They may have other uses in the world, but of those you have never learned. That is why you had sentenced him to death, and others like him. An execution without a firing squad. There was a big commissar, and I went to see him. He told me that 100,000 workers had died in the Civil War, and why couldn't one aristocrat die in the face of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics? And what is the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics in the face of one man? But that is a question not for you to answer. I'm grateful to that commissar. He gave me the permission to do what I have done. I don't hate him. You should hate him. What I am doing to you, he did it first. He stood looking down at her. He said nothing. He did not move. He did not take his eyes off hers. She walked towards him, her legs crossing each other with a slow, unsteady deliberation. Her body slouching back, she stood, looking at him, her face suddenly empty and calm, her eyes like slits, her mouth a thin incision into a flesh without color. She spoke, and he thought that her mouth did not open, words sliding out. Crushed from between closed lips, a voice frightened because it sounded too even and unnatural. That's the question, don't you? Why can't one aristocrat die in the face of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics? You don't understand that, do you? You and your great commissar and a million others like you, like him. That's what you brought to the world, that question and your answer to it. A great gift, isn't it? But one of you has been paid. I paid it. In you and to you. For all the sorrow your comrades brought to a living world, how do you like it, Comrade Andrei Taganov of the All-Union Communist Party? If you taught us that our life is nothing before that of the state, well then are you really suffering? If I brought you to the last hell of despair, well then why don't you say that one's own life doesn't really matter? Her voice was rising like a whip, lashing him ferociously on both cheeks. You loved a woman and she threw your love in your face. But the proletarian mines in the Donbass have produced 100 tons of coal last month. You had two altars and you saw suddenly that a harlot stood on one of them and Citizen Morozov on the other. But the proletarian state has exported 10,000 bushels of wheat last month. You have had every beam knocked from under your life, but the proletarian republic is building a new electric plant on the Volga. Why don't you smile and sing hymns to the toil of the collective? It's still there, your collective. Go and join it. Did anything really happen to you? It's nothing but a personal problem of a private life, the kind that only the dead old world could worry about, isn't it? Don't you have something greater? Greater is the word for your comrades use. Left to live for? But do you, Comrade Taganov? He did not answer. Her arms were thrown wide and her breast stood out under her old dress, panting, and he thought he could see every muscle of her body, a female's body in the last convulsion of rage. She screamed, "Now look at me. Take a good look. I was born and I knew I was alive and I knew what I wanted. What do you think is alive in me? What do you think I'm alive? Because I have a stomach and eat and digest the food? Because I breathe and work and produce more food to digest? Or because I know what I want and that something which knows how to want? Isn't that life itself? And who in this damned universe, who can tell me why I should live for anything but for that which I want? Who can answer that in human sounds that speak for human reason? But you have tried to tell us what we should want. You came as a solemn army to bring a new life to men. You tore that life you knew nothing about out of their guts, and you told them what it had to be. You took their every hour, every minute, every nerve, every thought in the farthest corners of their souls, and you told them what it had to be. You came and you forbade life to the living. You have driven us all into an iron cellar and you have closed all doors and you have locked us airtight, airtight till the blood vessels of our spirits burst. Then you stare and wonder what it is doing to us. Well, then look, all of you who have eyes left, look. She laughed, her shoulders shaking. Stepping close to him, she screamed at his face. Why do you stand there? Why don't you speak? Aren't you wondering why you have never known what I was? Well, here I am. Here's what's left after you took him, after you reached for the heart of my life. And do you know what that is? Do you know what it meant when you reached for my highest reverence? She stopped short. She gasped, a choked little sound as if he had slapped her. She slammed the back of her hand against her mouth. She stood in silence, her eyes staring at something she had seen suddenly, clearly, full for the first time. He smiled, very slowly, very gently. He stretched out his hand, palms up, shrugging sadly an explanation she did not need. She moaned, "Oh, Andre." She backed away from him, her terrified eyes holding his. He said slowly, "Kira, had I been in your place, I would have done the same thing for the person I loved, for you." She moaned, her hand at her mouth. "Oh, Andre, Andre, what have I done to you?" She stood before him, her body sagging, looking suddenly like a frightened child with eyes too big for its white face. He approached her and took her hand from her mouth and held it in his steady fingers. He said, and his words were like the steps of a man making an immense effort to walk too steadily. "You had done me a great favor by coming here and telling me what you have told. Because you see, you have given me back what I thought I had lost. You're still what I thought you were. More than I thought you were. Only, it's not anything you have done to me. It's what you had to suffer, and I gave you that suffering. And all those moments were to you." His voice broke. Then he shook his head and his voice was firm as a doctor's. "Listen, child, we won't talk anymore. I want you to keep silent for a while, for a little while, quite silent, even silent inside, you understand? Don't think. Try not to think. You're trembling, you have to rest. Here, I want you to sit down and just sit still for a few minutes." He led her to a chair and her head fell on his shoulder and she whispered, "But Andre, you forget that. Forget everything. Everything will be all right. Just sit still and don't think. He lifted her gently and put her down on a chair by the fire. She did not resist. Her body was limp, her dress was pulled high above her knees. He saw her legs trembling. He took his leather jacket and wrapped it around her legs. He said, "This will keep you warm. It's cold here. The fire hasn't been on long enough. Now sit still." She did not move. Her head fell back against the edge of the chair. Her eyes were closed. One arm hung limply by her side, and the pink glow out of the fire twinkled softly on her motionless hand. He stood in the darkness by the fireplace and looked at her. Somewhere in the club, someone was playing the Internationale. He did not know how long he had stood there. When she stirred and raised her head, he asked, "Do you feel better now?" Her head moved feebly, trying to nod. He said, "Now let's put your coat on and I'll take you home. I want you to go to bed, rest, and don't think of anything." She did not resist. Her head bent. She watched his fingers buttoning her coat, then she raised her head and her eyes looked into his. His eyes smiled at her in quiet understanding as he had smiled on their first meeting at the institute. He helped her down the long frozen stairs. He called a sleigh at the garden gate and gave the address of her home, Leo's home. He buttoned the fur blanket over her knees and his arm held her as the sleigh tore forward. They rode in silence. When the stopped, he said, "Now I want you to rest for a few days. Don't go anywhere. There's nothing you can do. Don't worry about him. Leave that to me." The snow was deep at the curb by the sidewalk. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the door and up the stairs. She whispered and there was no sound, but he saw the movements of her lips. "Andre." He said, "Everything will be all right." He returned to the sleigh alone. He gave the driver the address of the party club, where his comrades were waiting for a report on the agrarian situation. "And you have locked us airtight, airtight till the blood vessels of our spirits burst. You have taken upon your shoulders a burden such as no shoulders in history have ever carried. You said that your end justified your means, but your end, comrades, what is your end?" The chairman of the club struck his desk with the scribble. "Comrade Taganov, I'm calling you to order," he cried. "You will kindly confine your speech to the report on the agrarian situation. Agrarian situation." A wave of motion rippled through the crowded heads. Down the long, dim hall, and whispers rose. Somewhere in the back row, someone giggled. Andrei Taganov stood on the speaker's platform. The hall was dark. A single bulb burned over the chairman's desk. Andrei's black leather jacket merged into the black wall behind him. Three white spots stood out, luminous in the darkness. His two long, thin hands and his hands moved slowly over a black void. His face had dark shadows in the eye socket and the hollows of the cheekbones. He said, his voice dull, as if he could not hear his own words. "Yes, the agrarian situation, comrades. In the last 2 months, 26 party members have been assassinated in our outlying village districts. 8 clubhouses have been burned. Also, 3 schools and a communal farm storehouse. The counter revolutionary element of village hoarders has to be crushed without mercy. Our Moscow chief cites the example of the village Petrovishno, where upon their refusal to surrender their leaders, the peasants were lined in a row and every third one was shot, while the rest stood waiting. The peasants had locked 3 communists from the city in the local club of Lenin and boarded the windows on the outside and set fire to the house. The peasants stood and watched it burn and sang, so they would hear no cries. They were wild beasts. They were beasts run amok, beasts crazed with misery. Perhaps there too, in those lost villages somewhere so far away, there too they have girls, young and straight, and more precious than anything on the earth, who are driven into the last hell of despair, and men who love them more than life itself, who have to stand by and see it, and watch it, and have no help to offer. Perhaps they too. "Comrade Taganov," roared the chairman, "I'm calling you to order." "Yes, Comrade Chairman. Our Moscow chief cites the— What was I saying, Comrade Chairman?" Yes, the hoarders element in the villages. Yes, the party has to take extraordinary measures against the counter revolutionary element in the villages that threatens the progress of our great work among the peasant masses. Our great work, we came as a solemn army and forbade life to the living. We thought everything that breathed knew how to live. Does it? And aren't those who know how to live, aren't they too precious to be sacrificed in the name of any cause? What cause is greater than those who fight for it? And aren't those who know how to fight, aren't they the cause itself and not the means? Comrade Taganov, roared the chairman, I'm calling you to order. I'm here to make a report to my party comrades, Comrade Chairman. It's a very crucial report and I think they should hear it. Yes, it's about our work in the villages and in the cities and among the millions, the living millions. Only there are questions. There are questions that must be answered. Why should we be afraid if we can answer them? But if we can't, comrades, brothers, listen to me. Listen. You consecrated warriors of a new life. Are we sure we know what we are doing? No one can tell men what they must live for. No one can take that right because there are things in men, in the best of us, which are above all states, above all collectives. Do you ask what things? Man's minds and his values. Look into yourself honestly and fearlessly. Look and don't tell me. Don't tell anyone, just tell yourself. What are you living for? Aren't you living for yourself and only for yourself? Call it your aim, your love, your cause. Isn't it still your cause? Give your life, die for your ideal. Isn't it still your ideal? Every honest man lives for himself. Every man worth calling a man lives for himself. The one who doesn't live at all. You cannot change it. You cannot change it because it's the way the man is born, alone, complete, and end in himself. No laws, no party, no GPU will ever kill that thing in man which knows how to say, I. You cannot enslave man's mind, you can only destroy it. You have tried. Now look at what you are getting. Look at those whom you allow to triumph. Deny the best in men and see what will survive. Do we want the crippled, creeping, crawling, broken monstrosities that we are producing? Are we not castrating life in order to perpetuate it? Brothers, listen. We have to answer this. The two luminous white hands flew up over a black void and his voice rose, ringing as it had risen in a dark valley over the white trenches many years ago. We have to answer this. If we don't, history will answer it for us, and we shall go down with a burden on our shoulders that will never be forgiven. What is our goal, comrades? What are we doing? Do we want to feed a starved humanity in order to let it live? Or do we want to strangle its life in order to feed it? Comrade Taganov, roared the chairman, I deprive you of speech. I, panted Andrei Taganov, staggering down the platform steps. I have nothing more to say. He walked out down the long aisle, a tall, gaunt, lonely figure, heads turned to look at him. Somewhere in the back row, someone whistled through his teeth. A long, low, sneering, triumphant sound. When the door closed after him, someone whispered, Let Comrade Taganov wait for the next party purge. That brings us to the end of chapter 13 of part 2. Now we are moving on to part 2, chapter 14. Comrade Sonia sat at the table in a faded lavender kimono with a pencil behind her ears. The kimono did not meet in front, for she had grown to proportions that could not be concealed any longer. She bent under the lamp, running through the pages of a calendar. She seized the pencil once in a while, jotting hurried notes down on a scrap of paper, and bit the pencil, a purple streak spreading on her lower lip, for the pencil was indelible. Pavel Syrov lay on the Davenport, his stocking feet high on its arms, reading a newspaper, chewing sunflower seeds. He spat the shells into a pile on the newspaper spread on the floor by the Davenport. The shells made a little sizzling sound, leaving his lips. Pavel Syrov looked bored. Our child, said Comrade Sonia, will be a new citizen of new state. It will be brought up in the free, healthy ideology of the proletariat without any bourgeois prejudices to hamper its natural development. Yeah, said Pavel Sirov without looking up from his newspaper. I shall have it registered with the pioneers the very day it's born. Won't you be proud of your living contribution to the Soviet future when you see it marching with our other little citizens in blue trunks and with a red kerchief around its neck? Sure, said Pavel Sirov, spitting a shell down on the newspaper. We'll have a red christening. You know, no priest, only our party comrades, a civil ceremony, and appropriate speeches. I'm trying to decide on a name, and are you listening to me, Pavel? Sure, said Cyrov, sticking a seed between his teeth. There are many good suggestions for new revolutionary names here in the calendar. Instead of the foolish old saints' names, I've copied some good ones. Now, what do you think? If it's a boy, I think Ninel would be nice. What the hell's that? Pavel, I won't tolerate such language and such ignorance. You haven't given a single thought to a child's name, have you? Well, say I still have time, haven't I? You're not interested, that's all. Don't you fool me, Pavel Sirov, and don't you fool yourself thinking I'll forget it. Oh, come on now, Sonia. Really, you know. I'm leaving the name up to you. You know best. Yes, as usual. Well, Ninel is our great leader, Lenin's name. Reversed. Very appropriate. Or we could call him Will. That's for our great leader's initial. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. See? Yeah, well, either one's good enough for me. Now, if it's a girl, and I hope it's a girl because the new woman is coming into her own and future belongs to a greater extent than you men imagine to the free woman of the proletariat. Well, if it's a girl, I have some good names here, but the ones I like best is Oktyabrina because that would be a living monument to a great October Revolution. Sort of long, isn't it? What of it? It's a very good name and very popular. You know, Fimka Popova, she had a red christening week before last, and that's what she called her brat, Oktyabrina. Even got a notice in the paper about it. Her husband was so proud, the blind fool. Now, Sonia, you shouldn't insinuate. Listen to the respectable moralist. That bitch Fimka is known as a. Oh, to hell with her. But if she thinks she is the only one to get a notice in the paper about her little litter, I've copied some other names here too. Good modern ones. There's Maxina for Karl Marx, or else Communera, or something clattered loudly under the table. Oh, hell, said Comrade Sonia. Those damn slippers of mine. She wrigged uncomfortably on her chair, stretching out one leg, her foot groping under the table. She found the slipper and bent painfully over her abdomen, pulling the slipper on by a flat, worn out heel. Look at the old junk I have to wear, and I need so many things, and with the child coming, you would choose a good time to write certain literary compositions and ruin everything, you drunken fool. Now we won't bring that up again, Sonia. You know I was lucky to get out of it as I did. Yeah, well, I hope your Kovalensky gets the firing squad in a nice loud trial. I'll see to it that the woman of the Zenotil stage a demonstration of protest against speculators and aristocrats. She fingered the pages of the calendar and cried, here's another good one for a girl. Tribuna, or Barricada, or if we prefer something in the spirit of modern science, Universiteta. That's too long, said Cyrov. I prefer Oktyabrina, more symbol to that. I hope it's a girl. Oktyabrina Cyrova, the leader of the future. What do you want it to be, Pavel? A boy or a girl? I don't care, said Cyrov, so long as it isn't a twin. Now, I don't like that remark at all. It shows that you. They heard a knock at the door. The knock seemed too loud, too peremptory. Cyrov, his head up, dropped the newspaper and said, come in. Andrei Taganov entered and closed the door. Comrade Sonia dropped her calendar. Pavel Cyrov rose slowly to his feet. Good evening, said Andrei. Good evening, said Cyrov, watching him fixedly. What's the big idea, Taganov? Comrade Sonia asked, her voice low, husky, menacing. Andrei did not turn to her. He said, I want to speak to you, Cyrov. Go ahead, said Cyrov without moving. I said I want to speak to you alone. I said go ahead, said Cyrov, repeated. Tell your wife to get out. My husband and I, said Comrade Sonia, have no secrets from each other. You get out of here. said Andre without raising his voice, and wait in the corridor. Pavel, if he, you'd better go, Sonia, said Cyrov slowly, without looking at her, his eyes fixed on Andre. Comrade Sonia coughed out a single chuckle from the corner of her mouth. Comrade Taganov still going strong, huh? Well, we shall see what we shall see, and we don't have long to wait. She gathered her lavender kimono, pulling it tightly across her abdomen, stuck a cigarette into her mouth, and walked out, the slippers flapping against her heels. I thought, said Pavel Sirov, that you had learned a lesson in the last few days. I have, said Andre. What else do you want? You'd better put your shoes on while I'm talking. You're going out and you haven't much time to lose. Am I? Glad you let me in on the little secret. Otherwise, I might have said that I had no such intention, and maybe I'll still say it. Where am I going, according to Comrade Mussolini Taganov? To release Leo Kovalensky. Pavel Sirov sat down heavily and his feet scattered the pile of sunflower seed shells over the floor. What are you up to, Taganov? Gone insane, have you? You'd better keep still and listen. I'll tell you what you have to do. You'll tell me what I'll have to do? Why? And after that, I'll tell you why you will do it. You will dress right now and go to see your friend. You know what friend I mean, the one at the GPU. At this hour? Get him out of bed, if necessary. What you will tell him and how you will tell him is none of my business. All I have to know is that Leo Kovalensky is released within 48 hours. Now will you let me in on the little magic and that will make me do it? It's a little paper wand, Cyrov. 2 of them. Written by whom? You. Huh? Photographed from one written by you, to be exact. Cyrov rose slowly and leaned with both hands on the table. Taganov, you goddamn rat, he hissed. It's a rotten time to be joking. Am I? Well, I'll go see my friend, all right, and you will see Leo Kovalensky, all right, and it won't take you 48 hours either. I'll see to it that you get the cell next to his, and we will find out what documents. There are 2 photostats of it, as I said, only I don't happen to have either one of them. What? What did you? They are in the possession of 2 friends I can trust. It would be useless to try to find out their names. You know me well enough to discard any idea of the GPU torture chambers. If that idea occurs to you, their instructions are that if anything happens to me before Leo Kovalensky is out, the photostats go to Moscow. Also, if anything happens to him after he's out, you goddamn, you don't want those photostats to reach Moscow. Your friend won't be able to save your neck then, nor his own, perhaps. You don't have to worry about my becoming a nuisance. All you have to do is release Leo Kovalensky and hush up this whole case. You will never hear of those photostats again. You will never see them either. Cyrov reached for his handkerchief and wiped his forehead. You are lying, he said hoarsely. You have never taken any photostats. Maybe, said Andre. Want to take a chance on that? Sit down, said Cyrov, falling on the Davenport. Andre sat down on the edge of the table and crossed his legs. Listen, Andre, said Cyrov. Let's talk sense, all right? You're holding the whip. Still, do you know what you're asking? Not more than you can do. But good Lord in heaven, Andre, it's such a big case and we are all set with a first-class propaganda campaign and the newspapers are getting headlines ready to stop them. But how can I? How can I ask him? What am I going to tell him? That is none of my business. But after he's already saved my... Don't forget, it's in his interest too. He may have friends in Moscow and he may have some who aren't friends. But listen, and when party members can no longer be saved, they are the ones who get it worst. Worse than the private speculators, you know. Also a good occasion for first-class propaganda. Andre, one of us has gone insane. I can't figure it out. Why do you want Kovalensky released? That's none of your business. And if you have appointed yourself his guardian angel, then why the hell did you start the whole goddamn case? You started it, you know. You said that I had learned a lesson. Andre, haven't you got any party honor left? We need a good smashing bang at the speculators right now, with food conditions as they are and all the... That doesn't concern me any longer. You damn traitor. You said it was only copy of their letter in existence when you turned it in. Maybe I was lying then. Listen, let's talk business. Here, have a cigarette. No, thank you. Listen, let's talk as friend to friend. I take back all those things I said to you. I apologize. You can't blame me. You know how it is. You can see it's enough to make a fellow lose his mind a little. All right, you have your own game to play. I had mine, and I made a misstep. But then we are both no innocent angels, as I can see, so we can understand each other. We used to be good friends, childhood friends, remember? So we can talk sensibly about what I have an offer to make to you, Andre. A good one. That friend of mine, he can do a lot if I slip a couple of words to him, as you know. I guess you know that I have good enough on him for a firing squad too. You're learning the same game. I see, and doing it brilliantly. I must hand it to you, alright? We understand each other. Now I can talk plain. I guess you know that your spot in the party isn't so good anymore. Not so good at all. And particularly after that little speech you made tonight. Really, it won't be so easy on you at the next party purge. I know it. In fact, you're pretty sure to get the axe. I do. Well, then, what do you say if we make a bargain? You drop this case, and I'll see to it that you keep your party card, and not only that, but you can have any job you choose at the GPU and name your own salary. No questions asked and no ill feeling. We all have our own way to make. You and I, we can help each other a lot. What do you say? What makes you think that I want to remain in the party? Andre, you don't have to worry about helping me in the next purge. I may be kicked out of the party, or I may be shot, or I may be run over by a truck. That won't make any difference to you. Understand? But don't touch Leo Kowalinsky. See that no one touches him. Watch him as you would watch your own child, no matter what happens to me. I'm not his guardian angel. You are. Andre, Cyrov moaned. What is that damn aristocrat to you? I've answered that question once. Cyrov rose unsteadily and drew himself up for a last desperate effort. Listen, Andre, I have something to tell you. I thought you knew it, but I guess you don't. Only pull yourself together and listen. And don't kill me on the first word. I know there's a name you don't want to be mentioned, but I'll mention it. It's Kira Argonova. Well, listen, we are not mincing words, are we? Hell, now, not now, we aren't. Well, then listen. You love her and you have been sleeping with her for over a year. And wait, let me finish. Well, she's been Leo Kowalensky's mistress all the time. Wait, you don't have to take my word for it. Just check upon it and see for yourself. Why check upon it? I know it. Oh, said Pavel Syrov. He stood rocking slowly from heels to toes, looking at Andre. Then he laughed. Well, I should have known, he said. Get your coat, said Andre, rising. I should have known, laughed Cyrov. Why the saint of the Communist Party would go in for blackmail? You fool! You poor, virtuous, brainless fool. So that's the kind of grandstand you are playing? I should have known that the lofty heroics are a disease one never gets cured of. Come on, Andre, haven't you any sense left? Any pride? We have talked long enough, said Andre. You seem to know a lot about me. You should know that I don't change my mind. Pavel Syrov reached for his overcoat and pulled it on slowly, his pale lips grinning. All right, Sir Galahad, or whatever it's called, he said. Sir Galahad of the Blackmail Sword, you win this time. It's no use threatening you with any retaliation. Fellows like you get theirs without any help from fellows like me. In a year, this little mess will be forgotten. I'll be running the railroads of the USSR and buying satin diapers for my brat. You'll be standing in line for a pot of soup, and maybe you will get it, but you will have the satisfaction of knowing that your sweetheart is being by a man you hate. Yes, said Andrei. Good luck, Comrade Cyrov. Good luck, Comrade Taganov. Kira sat on the floor, folding Leo's underwear, putting it back into the drawer. Her dresses were still piled in a heap before her open wardrobe. Papers rustled all over the room when she moved. Down from the torn pillows fluttered like snow over the furniture. She had not been out for 2 days. She had heard no sound from the world beyond the walls of her room. Galina Petrovna had telephoned once and wailed into the receiver. Kira had told her to not worry and please not to come over. Galina Petrovna had not come. The Lavrovs had decided that their neighbor was not shaken by her tragedy. They heard no tears, they noticed nothing unusual in the frail little figure whom they watched sidewise when they crossed her room on their way to the bathroom. They noticed only that she seemed lazy, for her limbs fell and remained in any position, and it took her an effort to move them, and her eyes remained fixed on one spot, and it took a bigger effort to shift her glance, and her glance was like a 40-pound sack of sand being dragged by a child fist. She sat on the floor and folded shirts neatly, creasing every pleat, slipping them cautiously into the drawer on the palms of her two hands. One shirt had Leo's initial embroidered on the breast pocket. She sat staring at it without moving. She did not raise her head when she heard the door opening. Hello, Kira, said a voice. She fell back against the open drawer and it slammed shut with a crash. Leo was looking down at her. His lips drooped, but it was not a smile. His lips had no color, the circles under his eyes were blue and sharp, as if painted on by an immature actor. Kira, please, no hysterics, he said wearily. She rose slowly, her arms swinging limply. She stood, her fingers crumpling the hair on her right temple, looking at him incredulously, afraid to touch him. Leo, Leo, you are not free, are you? Yes, free, released, kicked out. Leo, how could it happen? How do I know? I thought you knew something about that. She was kissing his lips, his neck, the muscles exposed by his torn shirt collar, his hands, his palms. He patted her hair and looked indifferently over her head at the wrecked room. Leo, she whispered, looking up into his dead eyes. What have they done to you? Nothing. Did they? Did they? I heard they sometimes. No, they didn't torture me. They said they have a room for that, but I didn't have the privilege. I had a nice cell all to myself and 3 meals a day, although the soup was rotten. I just sat there for 2 days and thought of what last words I could say before the firing squad. As good a pastime as any. She took his coat off. She pushed him into an armchair. She knelt, pulling off his overshoes. She pressed her head to his knees for a second and jerked it away, and bent lower to hide her face and tied his unfastened shoestring with trembling fingers. He asked, have I any clean underwear left? Yes, I'll get it. Only, Leo, I want to know. You haven't told me. What is there to tell? I guess it's all over. The case is closed. They told me to see that I don't get into the GPU for a third time. He added indifferently. I think your friend Taganov had something to do with my release. You didn't ask him to? No, she said, rising. No, I didn't ask him. Did they ruin the furniture completely? And the bed too? Who? Oh, the search. No. Yes, I guess they have. Leo, she cried suddenly so that he shuddered and looked at her, lifting his eyelids with effort. Leo, have you nothing to say? What do you want me to say? Aren't you glad to see me? Sure, you look nice. Your hair needs combing. Leo, did you think of me? There? No. You didn't? No, what for? To make it easier? Leo, do you love me? Oh, what a question. What a question at what a time. You're getting feminine, Kira. Really, it's not becoming at all. I'm sorry, dear. I know it's foolish. I don't know why I had to ask it just then. You're so tired. I'll get you your underwear and I'll fix your dinner. You haven't had dinner, have you? No, I don't want any. Is there anything to drink in the house? Leo, you are not going again to. Leave me alone, will you? Get the hell out. Please, could you? Go to your parents or something. Leo, she stood, her hands in her hair, staring down at him incredulously. Leo, what have they done to you? His head was leaning back against the chair and she looked at the quivering white triangle of his neck and chin. He spoke, his eyes closed, only his lips moving, his voice even and flat. Nothing. No one is going to do anything to me anymore. No one. Not you, nor anyone else. No one can hurt me but you. And now you can't either. No one. Leo! She seized his limbs. white-faced head and shook it furiously, pitilessly. Leo, it can't get you like this. It won't get you. He seized her hand and flung it aside. Will you ever come down to earth? What do you want? Want me to sing of life with little excursions to the GPU between rhymes? Afraid they have broken me. Afraid they will get me? Want me to keep something that the mire can't reach? The more to suffer while it sucks me under? You're being kind to me, aren't you? Because you love me so much. Don't you think you would be kinder if you would let me fall into the mire? So that would be one with our times and would feel nothing any longer. Nothing. Ever. A hand knocked at the door. Come in, said Kira. Andrei Taganov came in. Good evening, Kira, he said and stopped, seeing Leo. Good evening, Andrei, said Kira. Leo raised his head with effort. His eyes looked faintly startled. Good evening, said Andrei, turning to him. I didn't know you were out already. I am out. I thought you had reason to expect it. I did, but I didn't know they would hurry. I'm sorry to intrude like this. I know you don't want to see any visitors. It's all right, Andrei, said Kira. Sit down. There's something I have to tell you, Kira. He turned to Leo. Would you mind if I took Kira out for a few minutes? I certainly would, Leo answered slowly. Have you any secrets to discuss with Kira? Leo. Her voice was almost a scream. She added quietly, her voice still trembling. Come on, Andrei. No, said Andrei calmly, sitting down. It isn't really necessary. It's not a secret. He turned to Leo. I just wanted to spare you the necessity of feeling indebted to me. But perhaps it would be better if you heard it too. Sit down, Kira. It's perfectly all right. It's about his release from the GPU. Leo was looking at him fixedly, silently leaning forward. Kira stood, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped behind her back, as if they were tired. She looked at Andrei. His eyes were clear, serene. Sit down, Kira, he said almost gently. She obeyed. There's something you should know, both of you, said Andrei, for your own protection. I couldn't tell you sooner, Kira. I had to be sure that it had worked. Well, it has. I suppose you know who's really behind your release. It's Pavel Syrov. I want you to know what's behind him in case you ever need it. It's you, isn't it? Asked Leo, a faint edge of sharpness in his voice. Leo, keep quiet, please, said Kira, turning away not to see his eyes watching her. It's a letter, Andrei continued calmly. A letter he wrote, and you know what that was. The letter had been sent to me by someone else. Syrov has powerful friends. That saved him. But he's not very brave. That saved you. The letter had been destroyed, but I told him that I had photostats of it and that they were in the possession of friends who would send them to higher authorities in Moscow, unless you were released. The case is killed. I don't think they will ever bother you again, but I want you to know this so that you can hold it over Syrov's head, if you need it. Let him think that you know the photostats are in good hands and on their way to Moscow. If he makes one step in your direction, that's all. I don't think you will ever need it, but it's a useful protection to have in these times and with your social record. And the photostats? Kira whispered. Where are they actually? There are no photostats, said Andrei. A truck thundered in the street below and the window panes trembled in the silence. Andrei's eyes met Kira's. Their eyes met and parted swiftly, for Leo was watching them. It was Leo who spoke first. He rose and walked to Andrei and stood looking down at him. Then he said, I suppose I should thank you. Well, consider me grateful. Only I won't say that I thank you from the bottom of my heart, because in the bottom of my heart I wish you had left me where I was. Why? Andrei asked, looking up at him. Do you suppose Lazarus was grateful when Christ brought him back from the grave? If he did, no more than I am to you, I think. Andrei looked at him steadily. Andrei's face was stern. His words were a threat. Pull yourself together. You have so much to live for. Leo shrugged and did not answer. You will have to close that store of yours. Try to get a job. Better not a very prominent one. You will hate it. But you will have to stick to it. If I can. You can. You have to. Do I? Said Leo, and Kira saw his eyes watching Andre closely. She asked, Andre, why did you want to tell us about Syrov's letter? So that you would know in case anything happened to me. What is going to happen to you, Andre? Nothing that I know of, he added, rising, except that I'm going to be thrown out of the party, I think. It it meant a lot to you, didn't it? Your party? It did. And and when you lose something that mean a lot to you, does it make any difference? No, it still means a lot to me. Will you hate them for it? For throwing you out? No. Will you forgive them someday? I have nothing to forgive because you see, I have a lot to be grateful for. In the past, when I belonged to the party, I don't want them to feel that they had been unjust or that I blame them. I can never tell them that I understand, but I would like them to know it. Perhaps they may be worried, although they have no right to question you any longer about a life they may have broken. If I could ask a favor when they throw me out, I would ask them not to worry about me, so that in the party annals, I won't become a wound, but a bearable memory. Then my memories will be bearable too. I think they would grant you that if they knew. I would thank them if I could. He turned and took his cap from the table and said, buttoning his jacket, well, I have to go. Oh, yes, another thing. Keep away from Morozov. I understand he is leaving town, but he will be back and starting some new scheme. Keep away. He will always get out of it and leave you to take the blame. Shall we see you again, Andre? Asked Kira. Sure, I'll be very busy for a while, but I'll be around. Well, good night. Good night, Andre. Wait a minute, said Leo suddenly. There's something I want to ask you. He walked to Andre and stood, his hands in his pockets, his lips spitting the words out slowly. Why did you do all this? Just what is Kira to you? Andre looked at Kira. She stood silent, erect. Looking at them, she was leaving it up to him. He turned to Leo and answered, just a friend. Good night, said Leo. The door had closed and the door in Lavrov's room, and in the silence they heard the door in the lobby opening and closing behind Andre. Then Kira tore forward suddenly. Leo could not see her face. He heard only a sound that was not a moan, not quite a cry. She ran out of the room and the door slammed shut behind her, and the crystals of the chandelier tinkled softly. She ran down the stairs out into the street. It was snowing. She felt the air like a scalding jet of steam striking her bare neck. Her feet felt very light and thin in their open slippers in the snow. She saw his tall figure walking away and she ran after him, calling, Andre! He wheeled about and gasped, Kira, in the snow without a coat? He seized her arms and jerked her back into the house, into the dim little lobby at the foot of the stairs. Go back immediately, he ordered. Andre, she stammered. I. In the light of a lamppost from across the street, she saw him smiling slowly, gently, and his hand brushed the wet snowflakes off her hair. Kira, don't you think it's better like this? He whispered. If we don't say anything and just leave it to our silence, knowing that we both understand and that we still have that much in common? Yes, Andre, she whispered. Don't worry about me. You have promised that, you know. Go back now. You will catch a cold. She raised her hand and her fingers brushed his cheek slowly, barely touching it, from scar on his temple to his chin, as if her trembling tip could tell him something she could not say. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips and held it for a long time. A car passed in the street outside through the glass door. The sharp beam of a headlight swept over their faces, licked the wall, and vanished. He dropped her hand. She turned and walked slowly up the stairs. She heard the door opening and closing behind her. She did not look back. When she returned to her room, Leo was telephoning. She heard him say, Hello, Tonia. Yes, I just got out. I'll tell you all about it. Sure, come right over. Bring some. I haven't got a drop in the house. Andrei Taganov was transferred from the GPU to the job of librarian in the library of Lenin's Nook of the Club of Women Houseworkers in the suburb Lesno. The clubhouse was a former church. It had old wooden walls that let the winds through to rustle the bright posters inside, a slanting beam of unpainted wood in the center, supporting a roof ready to cave in, a window covered with boards over the dusty remnants of a glass pane, and a cast iron burgoise that filled the room with smoke. There was a banner of red calico over the former altar and pictures of Lenin on the walls, pictures without frames cut out of magazines. Lenin as a child, Lenin as a student, Lenin addressing the Petrograd Soviet, Lenin in a cap, Lenin without a cap, Lenin in the Council of People's Commissars, Lenin in his coffin. There were shelves of books in paper covers, a sign that read, Proletarians of the World, Unite, and a plaster bust of Lenin with a scar of glue across his chin. Andrei Taganov tried to hold on. At 5 o'clock, when store closed, made yellow squares in the snow and light of tramways rolled like colored beads high over the dark streets, he left the Technological Institute and rode to Lesno, sitting at the window of a crowded tramway, eating a sandwich for he had no time to eat dinner. From 6 to 9, he sat alone in the library of the Lenin's Nook of the Club of Women's Houseworker, wrote card indexes, glued torn covers, added wood to the burgoise, numbered books, dusted shelves, and said when a woman's figure in a grey shawl waddled in, shaking snow off her heavy felt boots. Good evening, comrade. No, the ABC of communism is not in. I have your reservation, comrade. Yes, this is a very good book, comrade Samsonova. Very instructive and strictly proletarian. Yes, comrade Dagnilova, it is recommended by the party council as indispensable to the political education of a conscientious worker. Please, comrade, do not draw pictures on library books in the future. Yes, I know, comrade. The stuff isn't very good. It always smokes this way. No, we don't carry any books on birth control. Yes, comrades Seliva Nova. It is advisable to get acquainted with all the Comrade Lenin's works in order to understand our great leader's ideology. Please close the door, comrade. Sorry, comrade, we have no restroom. No, we have no books by Mussolini. No, we carry no love stories, comrade Ziablova. No, comrade Ziablova. I can't take you to the club dance Sunday. No, the ABC of communism is not in, comrade. In the offices of the GPU, they whispered, let Comrade Taganov wait for the next party purge. Comrade Taganov did not wait for the next party purge. On a Saturday evening, he stood in line at the district cooperative for his food rations. The cooperative smelled of kerosene and rotted onions. There was a barrel of sauerkraut by the counter, a sack of dried vegetables, a can of linseed oil, and bars of bluish Zhukov soap. A kerosene lamp smoked on the counter. A line of customers stretched across the long bare room. There was only one clerk. He had a sty over his left eye and he even looked sleepy. A little man stood in line ahead of Andrei. His coat collar was loose with a greenish, greasy patch at the nape of his neck. His neck was thin and wrinkled with an Adam's apple like a chicken's claw. He fingered his ration card nervously and fidgeted. Peering past the line at the counter, he sniffled sonorously, for he had a cold, and scratched his Adam's apple. He turned and grinned amicably up at Andrei. Party, comrade? He asked, pointing at a gnarled finger at the red star on Andrei's lapel. Me too, comrade. Sure, party member. Here's my star too. Cold weather we are having, comrade. Awfully cold weather. I hope the dried vegetables aren't all gone before our turn comes, comrade. They are wonderful for making soup julienne. Really should have meat for it, though. But I'll tell you a nice little trick. Just let them soak overnight, then boil them in plain water. And when it's almost ready, drop in a spoonful of sunflower oil, seed oil, just one spoonful. And it makes such nice grease spots float on the surface, just the same as if you had meat. Never tell the difference. Yes, I sure like soup julienne. Hope they are not all gone before our turn comes. He's not very fast, that clerk. Only I'm not complaining. No, please don't think I'm complaining, comrade. He peered at the counter, fingered his card, counted the coupons, scratched his Adam's apple. and whispered confidentially, "Only I hope the vegetables aren't all gone. And another thing, I wish they would give us all the stuff in the same place. We wait for the general products here, and tomorrow 2 hours at the bread store, and day after tomorrow here again for kerosene. Still, I don't mind. Next week they say we are going to get lard. That will be a holiday, won't it? That's something to look forward to, isn't it?" When Andre's turn came, the clerk shoved the ration at him, seized his card impatiently, and growled, "What the hell is the matter, citizen? Your coupon's half torn off." "I don't know," said Andre. "I must have torn it accidentally." "Well, I could have refused to accept it, you know. Not supposed to be half torn off. I got no time to check on all of you mucks. See that it's right next month." "Next month?" said Andre. "Yeah, and next year too, or else go empty bellied. Next." Andre walked out of the cooperative with a pound of sauerkraut, a pound of linseed oil, a bar of soap, and 2 pounds of dried vegetables for soup julienne. He walked slowly, and the streets were white with a hard, polished snow, and men's heel cut sharp ridges, creaking. Snow sparkled like salt crystals in the white circles of lamp post, and in the yellow at store cones of light at store windows. Snow twinkled like splinters of powdered fire. Under a soft, glassy fuzz of frost, a poster showed a husky giant in a red blouse, raising 2 arms imperiously, triumphantly to the red letters, "We are the builders of a new humanity." Andrei's steps were steady, calm. Andrei Taganov was always calm when he had reached a decision. He turned on the light when he entered his room and put his packages on the table. He took off his cap and jacket, hung them on a nail in the corner. A strand of hair fell across his forehead. He brushed it back with a long, slow movement. He had left a few coals smouldering in the fireplace and the room was hot. He took off his coat and straightened the wrinkled sleeves of his shirt. He looked around slowly. He saw some books on the floor and picked them up and put them neatly into a pile on the table. He lighted a cigarette and stood in the middle of the room, his elbow pressed to his side, like a wax figure in a store window, motionless but for the slow movement of one arm with a hand tracing an even line in the air, carrying to his lips a cigarette held in two long, straight fingers. Nothing moved in the room but that arm with a motionless hand, and the smoke rising slowly at his lips, then at his shoulder, then at his lips again, the ashes falling to the floor. When he felt a hot breath on his finger and saw the cigarette had burned, he threw the stub into the fireplace and walked to his table. He sat down and opened the drawers one by one and looked through their content. He took out a few papers and gathered them into a pile on the table. Then he rose and walked to the fireplace. He knelt and stuffed newspapers into the coals and blew at them until bright orange tongues leaped up. He threw 2 logs into the fire and stood, watching them until he saw white flames spurt from the creaking bark. Then he walked to the table, took the pile of papers he had selected and threw it into the fire. Then he opened the old boxes that served as his wardrobe. There were the things he did not want to be found in his room. He took a girl's black satin robe and threw it into the fire. He watched the cloth shriveling slowly in red, glowing, flameless patches with long, thin columns of smoke. With a heavy, acrid odor, he watched it, his eyes quiet, astonished. Then he threw in a pair of black satin slippers and a little lace handkerchief and a lace jacket with white ribbons. A sleeve of the jacket rolled out on the blackened bricks by the fire. He bent and lifted it delicately, placed it back over the flames. Then he found the American Resident, the little glass toy with a black imp in a red liquid. He looked at it and hesitated and put it cautiously down into the smoldering lace. The glass tube cracked and the liquid sizzled on the coals with a sharp little puff of steam, and the Resident rolled into a crack among the coals. Then he took out the black chiffon nightgown. He stood at the fireplace and held the gown in both hands, and his fingers crumbled slowly, softly, the light silk that felt like a handful of smoke. He held out it on his 2 palms and looked at his fingers through the thin black film and moved his fingers slowly. Then he knelt and spread it over the fire. For a second, the red coals were dimmed as under a clouded black glass. Then the gown shuddered as in a gust of wind, and a corner of the hem curled up, and a thin blue flame shot out of a fold at the neckline. He rose and stood watching it. He watched glowing red threads running down the black cloth and the black film twisting as if it were breathing, curling, shrinking slowly into a smoke light as the cloth. He stood for a long time looking at the motionless black thing with twinkling red edges that still had the shape of a gown, but it was not transparent any longer. Then he touched it softly with his foot. It crumbled almost before it was touched, and little black flames fluttered up into the chimney. He turned away and sat down at the table. He sat with one forearm resting on the table and the other on his knees, his hands hanging down, 10 fingers motionless, straight, broken only by the small angles of the joints, so still that they seemed grown fast to the air. An old alarm clock ticked on a shelf. His face was grave, quiet. His eyes were gentle, astonished, wondering. Then he turned and took a piece of paper from the drawer and wrote, "No one is to be held responsible for my death," and signed Andrei Tagunov. There was only one shot, and because the frozen marble stairway was long and dark and led to a garden buried in deep snow, no one came up to investigate. Damn. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. He killed himself. And this is the last chapter, chapter 15. So, this is not the last chapter. There are 3 more chapters, 15th, 16th, and 17th, which we will be reading in the next recording. I just checked. Fuck. I think. Okay. Let's end the reading for today. We will be reading the next 3 chapters either later in the day or in the next recording tomorrow. Bye bye for now. Thank you for the comments. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like and share if you like the video. Bye bye. Keep reading. Take care.